I showed you a magnificent facsimile replica of Leonardo da Vinci's Forrester Codex. I believe the Forrester I Codex. There are three.
Leonardo da Vinci finished the portrait, then returned and added one element that changes how we read every line of it. Technical scans show the sitter's arms were empty at first, and only later did the white ermine appear. Placed with care and meant to be noticed, court records and workshop evidence now suggest a calculated decision tied to power, identity, and timing inside the Milanese court. If the ermine was Leonardo's deliberate signal, what exactly was he saying, and who was meant to understand it? The scan that changed the story. For decades, the painting lived in books and galleries as a serene image of a young woman who turns her head with quiet control while she supports a pale creature that rests against her forearm. And for years, the argument about meaning revolved around soft claims that could never rise beyond debate. When a conservation team brought X-rays and ultraviolet light to the panel in a documented campaign, the results cut through the fog because the images revealed a clear three-stage sequence that begins with the sitter alone, moves to a small grey animal tucked into the crook of her arm, and ends with a larger white ermine that now reads like the new anchor of the design. That order matters because it proves that the animal is not an incidental prop chosen at the start with the same ease as a garment or a chain, and it instead becomes a deliberate insertion that requires structural adjustments to arm position and light flow along the diagonal from the face to the hand. A late change in a court studio carries cost in time and materials and reputation, which means the addition served a purpose strong enough to justify risk and delay. The scans map brushwork that overlays earlier passages with calm control, and the way the new fur rides the shape of the forearm tells you the painter recalculated weight and direction, so that the animal becomes the logic of the pose rather than a simple accessory. Technical evidence is not a theory because it is a record of actions taken by the painter in real time. And when you line those actions against the social facts of the court in Milan, you gain a new path for the reading of the image. Leonardo was not only a painter because he staged pageants and built devices for celebrations, and he understood how a single emblem could speak to a room without a line of text. The court relied on such signs to make claims with grace and to settle tensions without public fights. And a sign placed late can answer a change in circumstance that occurred between commission and delivery. The enlargement of the animal is therefore a clue to immediate motives and to the need for a message that could be read by those who mattered inside that palace culture. If a painter of this level reshaped a nearly finished portrait to lift one element into clear view, what prompted the change and who in the room was meant to hear it most? The girl, the duke, and the room. Most scholars identify the sitter as Cecilia Gallerani, and the match rests on court documents and on descriptions of her youth, education, and presence in the circle of Ludovico Sforza, which places the picture within a network where images served diplomacy as much as memory. A portrait did not merely preserve a likeness because it also announced a position, a connection, or a promise, and a successful portrait in that world made those claims with measured poise rather than noise. The sitter turns toward a point outside the frame as if a person of rank had just shifted in the space, and the line of the arm and the guarded grace of the hand create a subtle answer to that implied presence. The animal sits at that junction between gesture and gaze, and in that role it becomes more than an object in the sitter's care because it becomes a spoken name without a sound. Leonardo's position in Milan made him an expert in such communications because he built allegorical devices for festivals and engineered machines that transformed rooms into scenes that carried layered messages for guests who understood the grammar of symbols. If Ludovico needed a portrait that could advance a court narrative while preserving dignity for everyone involved, Leonardo was exactly the person who could shape it. A mistress whose favor depended on a powerful patron needed protection as much as praise, and a patron who balanced rivals needed a picture that spoke to loyalty without provoking open challenge. In that calculus, the painter could refine posture and light to answer a living situation rather than a timeless idea, and the scans confirm that he did exactly that. The first state shows the woman alone, which could have stood as a private likeness, yet the final state raises the animal into a sign that resonates in the room because it touches virtue, patronage, and authorship all at once. That is why the change matters, and that is why the new reading moves beyond belief into a grounded account of how court images work when events shift during production. If the room was trained to read signals without scandal, what exactly did the ermine say about the sitter, the patron, and the purpose of the image at the moment the change took place? What the ermine can say. Writers of the period report that the ermine stood for purity and moderation, and Leonardo repeats a version of that belief in his notes, which means the court already knew that association without needing a lecture. Place that emblem in the arms of a young mistress, and the picture turns attention into a shield, because the sitter holds a sign that states restraint and self-command, while the court understands her role with open eyes, and that contradiction resolves into a gesture of elevation that eases pressure in a room where status and feeling could collide. There is also a direct tie to Ludovico because he received an honor that linked his name to the ermine, and people in Milan would have recognized that connection without delay, so the animal reads as an indirect portrait of the patron as well as a mark of protection. A symbol can carry more than one meaning when it is placed with care, and here the creature also solves composition by drawing a firm white shape across a dark field and by binding the turn of the head to the line of the forearm. The scans show that the animal began smaller and darker and later became larger and brighter, and that technical fact supports the joined motives because the increased size reads more clearly across a room. The lighter coat supports the theme of restraint, and the stronger silhouette stabilizes the geometry. The late revision, therefore, serves the sitter, the patron, and the painter in a single move because it shields the woman, honors the duke, and perfects the structure. The three roles do not pull against one another because they meet in a single emblem that everyone in that court could decode. Technical work often confirms what people intuited in softer terms, and in this case the imaging confirms that Leonardo did not stumble into resonance by accident because he made a decision that required labor and risk after the likeness had already settled into shape. That decision is the most important line in the story because it shows that meaning did not drift in on the wind, but instead was built into the surface with clear intent. If the animal carries this much weight, how did Leonardo make the scene feel alive enough to hold that burden without breaking the calm that the court required from an image of grace? Turn, light, and a new kind of likeness. Italian portraits had often favored strict profile because profile manages distance and rank. Yet in the north, a three-quarter view gained ground because it brings a sitter into shared space with the viewer. And over time, that approach moved south and offered a new way to suggest presence. Leonardo takes the turn and gives it a measured pivot that lets the neck lengthen while the gaze moves past the frame. And that movement is more than display because it invites the viewer to imagine another person entering the room and drawing the sitter's attention. Light supports the fiction because it falls across her face and hand with a gradient that models form rather than tracing an outline. And the soft fall off into the dark ground lets the features breathe as if the air in the room touched the skin and fur. The hand that rests upon the animal is not a flourish added for elegance because it becomes the vehicle for the sign, and its careful modeling turns a lesson in anatomy into a sentence about care, duty, and steadiness. Leonardo's control of shadow along the jaw, the shoulder, and the fur tells the eye where to go next, and the viewer follows that path without noticing the guidance because the transitions are quiet and continuous. Comparison with earlier Italian work makes the shift visible because earlier portraits often set the figure in strict silhouette against a bright field, while here the figure carves volume out of darkness and steps forward through light in a way that suggests awareness and thought. The use of the turned head and the visible hand also moves beyond a simple report of features and begins to show a moment that belongs to the sitter within an implied social scene, which is exactly the kind of subtle drama that a court could accept. The achievement is not a trick because it rests on the patient build of half-tones and reflective light that turn the face and the fur into solid presences that share a single atmosphere. A symbol can crash a picture if it looks pasted on, yet here the animal belongs to the same air and responds to the same light, which makes the sign feel natural rather than forced. If pose and light made the message clear and calm, what motive best explains the decision to enlarge the animal late in the process and to accept the cost of that change inside a working court studio? 3 stages and the motive that fits the room. The lab work fixed the order of construction with unusual clarity because the sitter appears first without a companion, the small grey animal follows, and the bright ermine arrives last with changes to the arm, the fur, and the direction of emphasis, which means the 3rd stage is not an afterthought. A political motive fits that sequence because the sign of the ermine could point to Ludovico in a way that the room would grasp without any inscription, and such a gesture could be needed if alliances were shifting, if rivals were speaking, or if the patron wanted to settle a question without confrontation. A protective motive fits as well, because the picture could stabilize the position of Cecilia by clothing her role in the language of restraint and moderation, which is the kind of courtesy a patron could extend in a medium that would circulate in controlled spaces. An artistic motive also holds because the enlarged, bright shape balances the diagonal that runs from the head to the hand, and it gives the painter a firm anchor for light and shadow while linking the living touch of the hand to the meaning of the creature. The 3 motives do not exclude one another because a skilled court artist can fold them into a single action that satisfies function, feeling, and form. Leonardo's career shows the habit of solving several problems with one device, whether in stage machines that charmed crowds while carrying a political tale, or in drawings that united mechanism and grace, and that habit explains the choice to complete a costly revision at a late moment. The change is not a compromise because it strengthened the image on all fronts, and the fact that the revision sits so comfortably within the final scene is proof that the decision was guided by more than urgency. Painters in active studios do not invite delay without cause, yet the controlled overlay of paint proves a calm hand and a clear plan, and the success of the final state suggests that the room received exactly the signal it was meant to receive. If the sequence is proven and the motives align with the needs of the court, what remains to test, what can still be learned, and how will the public see those answers unfold as conservation and scholarship continue? What experts proved and what still waits. Experts proved that the animal is a late addition. They showed that the adjustment required changes to arm structure and light, and they confirmed that the new figure sits at the center of the message rather than at the edge of the design, which means the portrait must now be taught and displayed as a work whose meaning formed in stages. Museums can place the scan images beside the painting and invite visitors to see how lines and masses moved across the panel. And that practice will show that art is not a frozen miracle, but a living process that responds to patrons, to rooms, and to time. Teaching will change because classrooms can now explain how a symbol functions within a court system that needs elegance rather than open declarations, and students can trace the way a single decision alters both narrative and geometry. Writing will change because accounts will lean less on rumour and more on the demonstrable order of layers, which clarifies how evidence supports motive without leaning on fantasy. The picture becomes more, not less, when it is anchored in facts that display care, patience, and design, and audiences respond with new trust when they can watch the painter's hand make the choice that secures the meaning. Research still has room to run, and material analysis can test pigments and binders to see whether the fur layers differ from the earlier skin and cloth in ways that fit a later date, which would tighten the calendar of the revision and frame the choice within the schedule of known events at court. Archival work may yet surface a document that mentions the portrait in a way that fits the change. Though even without that paper, the chain of proof is strong because imaging already fixed the order, and context already explains why a patron and a painter would want the change. Collections can compare the panel with other portraits from Leonardo's circle to see whether a similar late shift appears when a sign needed strengthening, and that comparative work could show that the method was part of a broader practice rather than a single case. Public communication can remain calm and precise by saying what is known, what is still being tested, and what will be shared next, and that tone keeps attention on the evidence rather than on speculation. There is still work on pigments and binders. Material analysis can show whether the fur layers used mixtures different from earlier skin and cloth, and such a difference would support a staged revision carried out weeks or months later under changed studio conditions. Teams will test micro-samples with methods that protect the paint while returning data strong enough to place additions on a calendar. When results join the scan maps and the written record, the timeline for the ermine tightens and context clarifies. The role of the patron focuses, and the teaching story gains dates instead of guesswork for everyone. If the animal was the key that closed the message at the end, what other keys still rest beneath the upper skins of paint across Leonardo's work? And how many familiar images will shift in meaning once those hidden steps are mapped with equal care? The evidence now fixes the order in which this portrait took shape, and it shows that Leonardo rebuilt a nearly finished design to center an animal that reads as a clear sign for the room that first received it, which means the picture is not only a likeness of a young woman, but also a careful statement about loyalty, restraint, and protection set within the customs of a Milanese court that spoke in symbols. The scans prove the late addition, the changes to the arm and light confirm intent, the court record supplies motive, and the final state joins the message and forms so tightly that the emblem feels inevitable, even though it arrived last. That is why this finding matters, because it turns a long debate into a grounded reading that links patron sitter and painter in one decision that solved politics and composition at once, and it gives audiences a way to see how meaning is built step by step on the panel rather than guessed at from a distance. What follows is a clearer story to teach, a stronger base for future tests on materials and dates, and a reminder that Leonardo's genius lives in choices that can be traced and verified, which invites us to look again at every work that still holds layers we have yet to map, and to ask what other revisions may be waiting under the skin of paint. Thank you for staying to the end, because you now see how one late change can redirect the entire message of a portrait, and how scans and records can turn speculation into proof that anyone can follow. Share your reading of the ermine below, and tell us whether you see it first as a shield for Cecilia, a title for Ludovico, or a compositional anchor that holds the scene together, and we will feature the sharpest takes in a follow-up. If you want more investigations that use hard evidence and clear storytelling, tap subscribe and turn on alerts so you do not miss the next release. We are lining up new imaging studies and fresh archive finds that could shift other famous works in the same way, and your comments help set the order of what we cover next.